3, 2, 1, 0.
When your great-great-grandparents looked up at the sky on a clear, moonless night, it probably looked a lot like this. It's the same sky their ancestors saw, going all the way back to before the dawn of humanity. A spectacle of planets, stars, and nebulae, and a vast, hazy streak that the ancient Greeks named the Milky Way. It's actually hard to overstate just how profoundly the night sky shaped our ancestors' beliefs of space, time, and the meaning of life. All over the world, in every culture, people made up elaborate stories that tried to explain what these thousands of little spots of light were and how they got there. Then it all started to change, as the glow from artificial lighting began to wash out our view of the night sky. For many people today, the night sky now looks completely different from what their ancestors saw. Increasing urbanization and the resulting light pollution has made it so the Milky Way is no longer visible to 1/3 of the world's population. That's 4 out of every 5 North Americans and 3 out of every 5 Europeans. If you can see the Milky Way at night, there's a good chance you're in a rural area, far away from a major city. And if you're in a rural area, there's also a good chance that your internet connection isn't so great, if it exists at all. Compared to people living in cities, you're probably paying more money for lower speeds and less data. The good news is that this is changing. The bad news is that, once again, technology will make the night sky look completely different to future generations. Over the past 3 decades, having an internet connection has gone from a luxury to a necessity. Without it, many of us wouldn't be able to find jobs, get an education, or know what's happening in our community or the world at large. That's why, in 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution that condemned countries that deliberately interfered with people's internet access. But the resolution doesn't say that governments shouldn't provide internet access to their citizens, only that they can't take it away from those who already have it. In the United States, 1 in 4 households lack internet access. These households are often located in the poorest communities, which makes it even harder for the people living in them to get ahead. Globally, the number of internet users is rising sharply, but about 37% of the world's population, nearly 3 billion people, are still offline. There are a few reasons for this digital divide: age, race, and ethnicity. But from a technical standpoint, this access gap is due in large part to the cost of laying internet cable. Laying cable is expensive, especially for the so-called last mile between the local internet service provider and a person's home. In some parts of the United States, internet service providers charge homeowners tens of thousands of dollars to establish a broadband connection. Connecting those remaining 3 billion people will require lots of backhoes and shovels, digging up lots of neighborhoods. But is it possible to skip the cables and deliver the internet over the air? One of the most common ways to do this is via satellite. Satellite internet is nothing new. The first satellite designed to provide internet access was launched in 2005, and many more followed. The first generation of internet satellites were launched in an orbit that matches the rotation of the Earth, at an altitude of more than 20,000 miles above the Earth's surface. Satellites in this geosynchronous orbit fly over the same area on Earth and can communicate continuously with ground stations over 1/3 of the planet. But this comes at a cost. It takes about 1/4 of a second for the signal to make the 40,000-mile round-trip journey from the Earth to the satellite and back. Once you add other delays for processing the signal, that latency can add up to more than half a second. This latency can cause those awkward "are you still there" moments on Zoom calls and make gamers rage quit during late-night Call of Duty sessions. That's why, in recent years, companies have been launching internet satellites into low Earth orbit just 340 miles or so up. This allows for latencies that are just about the same as what you get with ground-based internet. But at this altitude, a satellite can only see a tiny portion of the Earth's surface. So to provide coverage to a wider area, you're going to need lots and lots of satellites. And of course, lots of receivers on Earth. Each subscriber will likely need a specialized phased array antenna to access the network of moving satellites. Phased array antennas are a type of antenna array that comes with sort of electronic steering that allows them to change the direction and shape of radiated signals without physically moving the antenna. In recent years, satellites have become much cheaper to build using commercially available components. And thanks in large part to the reusable rocket technology developed by SpaceX, they're getting much cheaper to launch. In the 5 decades after the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, the number of satellites placed into Earth's orbit each year grew steadily, with between 60 to 100 satellites launched each year. That number began to spike dramatically in the early 2010s, with over 2,000 launched in the past 2 years alone. About 60% of these were launched by SpaceX for its satellite internet service called Starlink. Since launching its first batch of 60 Starlink satellites in May 2019, the company has quickly become the predominant satellite operator in the space around our planet. Of the nearly 5,000 operating satellites in orbit around Earth today, about 2,000 of them are Starlink satellites. And they're just getting started. The Federal Communications Commission has given SpaceX approval to orbit a total of 12,000 satellites, and the company has filed paperwork to launch another 30,000. Many astronomers aren't happy with the sudden population boom in low Earth orbit. The Starlink satellites are surprisingly reflective, and they have a tendency to photobomb telescope images. SpaceX says that they are working to reduce the glare from their satellites. They've already added umbrella-like sun visors, which have helped dim them a bit. But SpaceX is by no means the only company building fleets of broadband satellites. The British company OneWeb has launched more than 400 of its satellites into orbit since 2019. Amazon has received approval from the FCC to launch its own satellite constellation, Project Kuiper. Canadian company Telesat is planning to launch a few hundred satellites in the next few years. These tens of thousands of satellites could go a long way in closing the so-called digital divide that keeps billions of people from fully participating in the global economy. But they could also make the night sky look like someone hung a disco ball from the moon. There are lots of other potential effects of putting so many satellites in orbit in such a short time. The potential return on investment has Starlink and its competitors in a hot pursuit of establishing a dominant market position. We could end up seeing several redundant satellite networks fighting for dominance in the skies. Or maybe having several satellite-based internet service providers could help keep the price competitive. No matter which competitor manages to corner the market first, there will be hundreds of rockets, thousands of satellites, and millions of phased array antennas produced, with an enormous amount of raw materials and energy burned along the way. Some rockets can produce greenhouse gases and damage the ozone layer. When satellites burn up in the atmosphere at the end of their lives, they can deposit aluminum into the air and oceans. Researchers have argued that incinerated aluminum in the atmosphere could punch an even larger hole in the ozone layer, or help to scatter incoming sunlight, actually cooling the planet. When they don't burn up on re-entry, they can hit people. The chances of someone being struck by any particular falling satellite are vanishingly small. But they're not zero. A study by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers found that the overall risk of someone getting hit with a fragment from a Starlink satellite stood at 45% every 6 years. SpaceX says that it has since replaced some of the materials used in its Starlink satellites so that all of its components will burn up in the atmosphere. But other companies in other countries might not be so careful. An even more likely scenario is that in such a crowded environment, satellites could smash into each other. The European Space Agency estimates that since 1957, there have been more than 630 collisions, breakups, or explosions that have resulted in space debris. Many of these fragments produced from these events are tiny. But in low Earth orbit, objects travel at about 18,000 miles per hour. At that speed, a body with a mass of just 1 gram has about twice the kinetic energy of a .50 caliber bullet. And every time a satellite breaks up in space, it increases the chances that debris will hit another satellite, which would in turn create more debris, which in turn would hit more satellites. In the 1970s, NASA astrophysicist Donald Kessler calculated that such collisions could create a domino effect that would result in a belt of space junk encircling the planet, making certain orbits unusable for generations. An unlucky series of collisions could end up grounding humanity, trapping our species in a satellite coffin for hundreds of years. That sounds bad, but there's actually an even worse scenario that can arise from having tens of thousands of satellites around Earth. The Zwicky Transient Facility is an observatory in California that scans the entire northern sky every 2 days, looking for anything in the sky whose brightness suddenly changes. It looks for faraway things like supernovas, neutron star collisions, and gamma-ray bursts. And it also looks for closer things like incoming asteroids. In 2019, the year that Starlink launched its first batch of satellites, a study of twilight images from the observatory found that half of 1% of the images had streaks from the satellites in them. By late 2021, that number had risen to 20%. And this is just out of 2,000 Starlink satellites in orbit, out of a potential 42,000. The chances of a planet-killing asteroid hiding behind a Starlink streak are incredibly small, but the potential consequences couldn't be bigger. There are lots of potential downsides that come with having tens of thousands of satellites lighting up the night sky, but they're probably outweighed by the promise of delivering internet connectivity to areas where it's been lacking. As internet access continues to expand, it's lifting millions of people out of poverty and ensuring the visibility of human rights abuses that might otherwise have been swept under the rug. So all in all, any effort to send more satellites into orbit to make the internet more accessible to more people on Earth is probably worth it. Worth it, of course, if everyone on Earth can afford to access it. Right now, this internet access is pricey enough to be out of reach for many people. Hopefully, industry competition, increasing popularity, and time helps bring that price down. Because I'm looking forward to a future where no one has to awkwardly ask for the Wi-Fi password again. For more videos like this, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any great content. And look out for CuriosityStream on social media. Links in the description.